The sky was perfect. Across the shallow seas of what would one day be called the Gulf of Mexico, morning light filtered through coastal mists, illuminating a world that had thrived for 165 million years. Tyrannosaurus rex tracks pressed deep into riverbank mud. Triceratops herds moved slowly across flowering plains. Pterosaurs, with wingspans wider than small planes, glided on thermal currents, their shadows racing across waters teeming with mosasaurs and ancient sharks. The Cretaceous world was not dying. It was thriving, evolving, expanding into every corner of land, sea, and sky. Nothing suggested that within 24 hours this entire empire would collapse into ash and darkness. But 66 million years ago, something was already screaming toward Earth at speeds beyond comprehension. A mountain of rock and ice, roughly 6 miles across, hurtled through the void at 45,000 miles per hour. Its trajectory had been set millions of years earlier, perhaps by a collision in the asteroid belt, perhaps by Jupiter's gravity nudging it onto a new path. Whatever cosmic accident set it in motion didn't matter anymore. The asteroid was already past the orbit of Mars, then Earth's moon, then entering the final stretch of its journey. In the final seconds before impact, it compressed the atmosphere ahead of it into a superheated wall of plasma. Dinosaurs on the Yucatan coast looked up. Some of them may have even seen it coming. A second sun blazing across the sky, brighter than anything evolution had prepared them to understand. What followed wasn't an explosion. It was the end of a world. This is the story of the final 24 hours of the dinosaurs, reconstructed from decades of geological detective work, fossil evidence locked in stone, and the spectacular, terrible physics of planetary catastrophe. This is the story of the last day of the Cretaceous, when Earth's mightiest creatures faced something no amount of strength, speed, or evolutionary success could overcome. This is the day the sky fell, the seas rose, and the rulers of Earth became ash scattered across a dying world. The Earth of the late Cretaceous looked nothing like the planet we know. Continents had different shapes, different positions. The Atlantic Ocean was narrower. India was an island racing northward toward Asia. Antarctica was green, forested, and ice-free. Sea levels sat roughly 500 feet higher than today, flooding vast areas of continental interiors and creating shallow seaways that split North America down its center. These warm, productive waters hosted ecosystems unlike anything in modern oceans. Mosasaurs up to 50 feet long, enormous sea turtles, schooling ammonites, and fish that would make today's marlins look modest. The climate was hot, humid, and remarkably stable. There were no polar ice caps. Tropical conditions extended far into what are now temperate zones. Forests grew within a few hundred miles of both poles, hosting dinosaurs adapted to months of winter darkness, but not to freezing cold. Carbon dioxide levels were several times higher than pre-industrial human levels, creating a greenhouse world where warmth circulated efficiently and seasonal temperature swings were gentler. Rain was abundant. Rivers carved through landscapes filled with flowering plants, a relatively recent evolutionary innovation that was reshaping terrestrial ecosystems from the ground up. Dinosaurs had reached their peak diversity. Tyrannosaurus rex ruled the northern continent of Laramidia, hunting hadrosaurs and ceratopsians across vast coastal plains. In the south, abelisaurids filled the apex predator role, their shorter, taller skulls built for different killing strategies. Sauropods still roamed in diminished numbers, their long-necked forms browsing vegetation no other herbivore could reach, and chylosaurs carried armor that could shatter tyrannosaur teeth. Pachycephalosaurs butted heads in dominance displays. Each ecological niche was filled, refined, perfected through millions of years of evolutionary trial and error. The skies belonged to pterosaurs and birds. Quetzalcoatlus northropi the largest flying animal ever, stalked through inland environments on legs as tall as a human, its toothless beak snapping up small vertebrates. Smaller pterosaurs crowded coastlines, fishing in shallow waters. Early modern birds had already diversified into recognizable groups: shorebirds, waterfowl, forest dwellers. They shared the air with more primitive avians still carrying teeth and clawed wings. Evolutionary experiments that hadn't yet settled into modern forms. Beneath the dinosaurs' feet, mammals scurried through underbrush and climbed through tree canopies. They were small, few exceeded the size of a modern badger, but they were diverse, filling nocturnal niches where keen senses mattered more than size. Their warm blood, fur and advanced hearing gave them advantages in low light conditions. Some were insectivores, others ate plants, seeds or scavenged carrion. A few even preyed on small dinosaurs, their fossils found with tiny dinosaur bones in their stomach cavities. Mammals were successful in their own right, but they lived in the shadows, waiting for an opportunity that wouldn't come through competition. The fossil record from sites like Hell Creek in Montana, the Nemegt Formation in Mongolia, and the Lametta Formation in India shows ecosystems operating at full capacity right up to the boundary layer, the thin geological stripe marking the end of the Cretaceous. There's no evidence of decline, no signal that dinosaurs were already failing. Diversity remained high. Fossil abundances showed healthy populations. New species were still evolving. The world was not winding down. It was cut off mid-sentence, mid-stride, mid-flight. And then, at approximately 11:47 a.m. local time on what would become the northern Yucatan Peninsula, the asteroid struck. First contact, the Chicxulub impact. The asteroid hit what is now the town of Chicxulub Puerto at an angle of roughly 60 degrees, slamming into shallow tropical seas overlying a thick carbonate platform. The impact released energy equivalent to 10 billion Hiroshima bombs, about 100 million megatons of TNT. To call this an explosion undersells the physics. The asteroid vaporized instantly, along with thousands of cubic kilometers of rock. A crater 110 miles wide and 20 miles deep opened in less than a second. The Earth's crust, solid rock that had been stable for millions of years, behaved like liquid, flowing outward in massive waves frozen mid-surge. The impact generated temperatures exceeding 20,000 degrees Celsius at ground zero, hotter than the surface of the sun. The rock didn't melt, it vaporized into plasma. The atmosphere directly above the impact site was blown away into space. In its place rushed superheated vapor and molten ejecta, creating a plume that rose hundreds of miles above the surface. This plume contained pulverized rock, vaporized asteroid fragments, sulfur from the vaporized seabed, and enough carbon dioxide to alter global chemistry for millennia. Within the first second, the shockwave radiated outward at supersonic speeds. It moved through rock faster than sound moves through air, shattering bedrock, triggering earthquakes that would have measured magnitude 10 or higher, orders of magnitude beyond anything recorded in human history. Trees within 1,000 miles were flattened instantly, not by wind, but by the shockwave traveling through the ground itself. Animals in this zone died before their nervous systems could process what was happening. The closest dinosaurs to the impact, Alamosaurus herds in what is now Texas, Pterosaurs fishing the western interior seaway, early crocodilians basking on Gulf Coast beaches, were obliterated in the first 3 seconds. The blast wave that followed moved through the atmosphere like the hand of an angry god. Within 30 seconds, everything within 600 miles of the impact was engulfed in winds exceeding 1,000 miles per hour. These weren't normal winds. They were walls of superheated air dense with molten rock droplets. Forests ignited spontaneously. Animals were thrown like leaves. The ground itself caught fire as radiant heat from the impact plume ignited everything combustible. The Cretaceous landscape, rich with resinous conifers, flowering plants full of volatile oils, and dead wood dried under tropical sun, burned with terrifying speed. But the real killer was already airborne. The impact excavated the Yucatan carbonate platform, which was rich in sulfur-bearing minerals. This sulfur vaporized and combined with atmospheric moisture to form sulfuric acid aerosols. Simultaneously, billions of tons of pulverized rock, some in particles fine as talcum powder, were ejected into the stratosphere. This material began spreading outward in an expanding ring, carried by high-altitude winds. Within minutes, the sky over Central America began to darken. Within an hour, ejecta was raining down across North America. Within 6 hours, the entire planet would be shrouded. Seismic stations, if any had existed, would have detected the impact immediately. The shockwave reverberated through Earth's core, triggering earthquakes on the opposite side of the planet. Volcanoes from Indonesia to Italy to South America responded to the sudden pressure release, some erupting, others shifting their magma chambers in ways that would cause eruptions years later. The entire planet rang like a bell struck by a hammer, its crust flexing and settling for days afterward. For dinosaurs within 1,500 miles of ground zero, the next few minutes brought scenes beyond description. The sky turned orange, then red, then black. The air itself seemed to ignite. Ash and burning debris fell like apocalyptic snow. Tyrannosaurs, hadrosaurs, pterosaurs, apex predators, and humble plant eaters alike ran, flew, or simply stood in confusion as their world dissolved into fire and darkness. Many would die in the first hour, but their suffering was brief compared to what awaited the survivors farther from the impact. The Earth had just been hit by a bullet moving at cosmic speeds, and the shockwaves, physical, atmospheric, and biological, were only beginning. "60 minutes after impact, the western interior of North America, thousands of miles from ground zero, was experiencing catastrophe. The seismic waves arrived first. Earthquakes rippled through the continent, toppling ancient sequoias, collapsing riverbanks, triggering landslides in mountainous regions. Edmontosaurus herds grazing in what is now Montana felt the ground shudder. Triceratops moving through forested valleys stumbled as the earth moved beneath them. These weren't gentle tremors. They were sustained, violent shocks that continued for minutes, their magnitude slowly decreasing, but never quite stopping. Then came the sound. The impact generated an acoustic shockwave that traveled through the atmosphere at the speed of sound. By the time it reached the Hell Creek ecosystem, it had weakened from lethal to merely deafening, but it was still loud enough to rupture eardrums and disorient everything that heard it. Dinosaurs adapted to hearing low-frequency calls from miles away suddenly had their sensory world shattered. Birds fell from trees. Pterosaurs wheeled in confusion. Small mammals burrowed deeper, instinct driving them underground. But the real horror arrived from above. The impact had launched trillions of tons of material into ballistic trajectories. Much of this ejecta, chunks of rock ranging from pebble-sized to boulder-sized, was ejected at speeds high enough to reach space before falling back. As these objects re-entered the atmosphere, friction heated them to incandescence. They became meteorites, thousands of them, streaking through the sky in every direction. This wasn't a meteor shower, it was a global bombardment of molten rock. Within the first hour, the sky over North America filled with streaking lights. Each one was a piece of the Yucatan Peninsula, superheated to glowing temperatures, plummeting back to Earth. When they struck the ground, they ignited everything they touched. Forests that had stood for millions of years caught fire within minutes. The air itself heated from the radiant energy of thousands of atmospheric re-entries happening simultaneously. Temperature spikes of several hundred degrees occurred in exposed areas. Animals caught in the open experienced conditions similar to being inside an oven. Paleontological evidence from the Hell Creek Formation shows a thin layer of spherules, tiny glass beads formed from molten rock droplets that cooled in mid-air. These spherules blanketed the landscape, settling into every crevice, covering leaves, pooling in water, mixing with soil. Chemical analysis shows they originated from the Chicxulub impact site. Their distribution tells us that within 1 to 2 hours, ejecta from the impact had reached the entire Western Hemisphere. The fallout was global in scope and devastating in intensity. Forest fires ignited simultaneously across vast areas. Unlike normal wildfires that spread gradually, these fires erupted everywhere at once as radiant heat and falling ejecta ignited vegetation. The Hell Creek ecosystem, filled with moisture-loving plants, deadwood and resinous conifers, burned with apocalyptic intensity. Smoke rose in massive columns, creating fire tornadoes and generating their own weather systems. Winds fed the flames. Oxygen-rich Cretaceous air made combustion more efficient. Within hours, millions of square miles were ablaze. Dinosaurs responded with instinct and panic. Hadrosaurs fled toward water, their duck-billed snouts barely clearing the surface as they submerged in rivers and lakes. Tyrannosaurs, unbothered by smaller prey for once, moved through smoke-choked forests seeking safety that didn't exist. Ankylosaurs, built to withstand attacks from the largest predators, had no defense against fire. Their armor trapped heat. Many would have cooked inside their own protective shells. Ceratopsians stampeded in massive herds, their frills and horns useless against an enemy they couldn't see or fight. Pterosaurs faced impossible choices. Flying meant exposure to radiant heat and falling debris. Landing meant fire. Many took to the air anyway, their light skeletons and large wings carrying them high above the smoke. Some may have survived the first hour by staying aloft, riding thermal currents generated by the fires themselves. But exhaustion would claim them eventually. Pterosaurs needed to land, to rest, to feed. Within hours, safe landing sites would become impossible to find. Small mammals, burrowed underground, fared better. Their subterranean refugees insulated them from radiant heat and falling ejecta. Species like Alphodon and early primates survived in underground chambers while the surface world burned. These burrows, dug for protection against predators, became lifeboats. The animals inside had no idea they were witnessing the end of an era. They simply stayed hidden while the ground above them was sterilized by fire. Birds faced similar challenges to pterosaurs, but had one advantage: they were smaller. A sparrow-sized bird requires less food, can hide in smaller spaces, and can ride out catastrophe in ways a giant pterosaur cannot. Many died, but enough found shelter in rock crevices, in burrows abandoned by mammals, or in areas temporarily spared by the fires. Their survival was accidental, arbitrary, but it was survival nonetheless. By the end of the first hour, North America was transformed. The sky was dark with smoke and ash. Fires raged across landscapes that had been green and thriving at dawn. The air was thick with particles and difficult to breathe. Temperature fluctuations between the heat of fires and the cooling from blocked sunlight created unstable weather. And this was just the beginning. The ejecta curtain was still spreading, the fires still growing, and worse was coming. The asteroid struck the ocean. While this may have spared some land-dwelling creatures from instant vaporization, it created a different nightmare: mega tsunamis. The impact displaced trillions of gallons of water in an instant, generating waves that made modern tsunamis look like ripples in a bathtub. Within minutes of impact, walls of water hundreds of feet high radiated outward from ground zero in all directions. These weren't normal waves with peaks and troughs. They were moving mountains of water, carrying the momentum of the impact itself. The first wave struck the Gulf Coast of North America within 20 minutes. Coastal plains that stretched for hundreds of miles inland were inundated within the hour. Mosasaurs and Plesiosaurs hunting in shallow seas were picked up and carried miles inland, their bodies eventually deposited in what would become fossil beds in Texas and Alabama. Pterosaurs nesting on coastal cliffs were swept away before they could take flight. Dinosaurs drinking from coastal rivers were drowned or battered by debris as seawater surged upstream with unstoppable force. The waves didn't stop at the Gulf Coast. They propagated across the Atlantic, striking what is now the eastern seaboard of North America, Europe, and Africa. Geological evidence from North Carolina shows marine deposits from the Chicxulub tsunami sitting atop Cretaceous soil layers, proving ocean water reached far inland. In New Jersey, fossilized tree trunks snapped at their bases and aligned in the same direction show the force and direction of water flow. These tsunamis weren't isolated events. They circled the planet multiple times, each passage weaker than the last, but still powerful enough to reshape coastlines. The physics of these waves was extraordinary. Normal tsunamis generated by underwater earthquakes involve vertical displacement of the seafloor. The Chicxulub impact created both vertical and horizontal displacement, ejecting water upward and outward simultaneously. Computer models show initial wave heights near the impact site exceeded a mile. These waves moved at speeds of 400 to 500 miles per hour in deep water, slowing as they approached shorelines but gaining height as the seafloor rose beneath them. Marine ecosystems suffered catastrophically. The impact occurred in shallow tropical seas rich with life. Coral reefs, fish populations, ammonites, sharks, and marine reptiles. Everything within a 1,000-mile radius was instantly destroyed. Beyond that radius, the tsunami scoured the seafloor, stripping it of life. Marine organisms that had evolved in stable environments with predictable currents suddenly faced churning, debris-filled waters. Ammonites, with their delicate chambered shells, were particularly vulnerable. Many species went extinct in the first hours simply from the physical trauma of impact-generated waves. Coastal dinosaurs, some of which lived their entire lives along shorelines, faced extinction before the day ended. Spinosaurids, if any still existed by the end of the Cretaceous, were aquatic predators hunting fish in rivers and coastal areas. The tsunami would have caught them by surprise, their crocodile-like bodies offering no advantage against walls of water carrying uprooted trees and rocks. Smaller theropods hunting along beaches were swept inland. Even larger dinosaurs, capable of withstanding most natural threats, were no match for mega tsunamis. The waves carried marine sediments far inland, burying Cretaceous landscapes under layers of sand, shells, and marine organisms. This geological signature, known as the Impact Tsunami Deposit, has been found across the Gulf Coast and Caribbean. In some locations, the deposit is several feet thick, containing a chaotic mix of marine and terrestrial fossils jumbled together. This mixing tells us that coastal ecosystems collapsed instantly, their components scattered and buried in geological moments. But tsunamis, however devastating, were temporary. The water receded, draining back to the ocean, leaving behind mud, debris, and dead organisms. Survivors could theoretically rebuild. The real problem was what was happening in the atmosphere. While coastlines were being reshaped by water, the entire planet was being reshaped by fire and darkness. By the third hour after impact, the ejector curtain had expanded across most of the Western Hemisphere. This wasn't ordinary dust. It was a mixture of pulverized rock, vaporized asteroid fragments, sulfuric acid aerosols, and soot from continent-wide fires. The particles ranged in size from microscopic aerosols that would stay airborne for years to sand-sized spherules that fell within hours. Together, they formed a shroud that blocked sunlight with terrifying efficiency. The mechanism was simple, but deadly. Sunlight striking the ejector layer was either absorbed or reflected back into space. Very little reached the surface. Measurements from the geological boundary layer show iridium concentrations hundreds of times normal levels, a signature of extraterrestrial material. But they also show massive spikes in soot, indicating that wildfires contributed significantly to the atmospheric darkening. The combination was lethal. Impact ejector provided the initial blackout, while ongoing fires continually replenished the ash layer. Within 6 hours of impact, sunlight levels across North America had dropped to twilight conditions. By 12 hours, darkness was nearly complete. This wasn't nighttime darkness where eyes adjust and moonlight provides some visibility. This was absolute darkness, the kind found in deep caves. Dinosaurs that had evolved under endless tropical sunshine suddenly lived in permanent night. The temperature began to drop immediately. The Cretaceous greenhouse, which had maintained warm conditions for millions of years, was cut off from its energy source. Photosynthesis stopped. This single fact cascaded through every ecosystem on Earth. Plants, which had been growing continuously in the warm, CO2-rich Cretaceous climate, halted all metabolic activity within hours. Without sunlight, they couldn't produce energy. Within days, leaves began dying. Within weeks, even hardy plants were burning through their energy reserves, trying to survive. Herbivorous dinosaurs, which required enormous amounts of plant matter daily, faced immediate starvation. A Triceratops needed to eat hundreds of pounds of vegetation every day. An Edmontosaurus required even more. That food supply was vanishing. Marine ecosystems faced the same collapse. Phytoplankton, microscopic organisms forming the base of oceanic food webs, died within days. These organisms required sunlight just like land plants. When they died, they sank, removing oxygen from the water as they decomposed. Zooplankton, which fed on phytoplankton, starved. Fish that ate zooplankton starved. Larger predators that ate those fish starved. The entire marine food web, built over millions of years, collapsed from the bottom up. The darkness also disrupted temperature regulation. Dinosaurs were likely mesothermic, somewhere between cold-blooded reptiles and warm-blooded mammals. Many probably maintained stable body temperatures through a combination of metabolic heat and behavioral thermoregulation. But behavioral thermoregulation requires sunlight. Sauropods basked in the morning sun to warm up. Small theropods sheltered during midday heat. These strategies stopped working when sunlight disappeared. Dinosaurs accustomed to tropical warmth suddenly faced plummeting temperatures with no way to compensate. Within 24 hours of impact, surface temperatures had dropped significantly. The exact amount is debated. Estimates range from 10 to 30 degrees Celsius, depending on location and modelling assumptions. But even a 10-degree drop was catastrophic for organisms adapted to stable tropical conditions. Cold-blooded organisms became sluggish, metabolic rates dropped, immune systems weakened. Diseases that had been suppressed by warm conditions began spreading through stressed populations. The psychological impact on dinosaurs cannot be overstated. These were animals that had evolved over millions of years in stable conditions. Their behaviours, instincts, and survival strategies all assumed a functioning world. Sunlight, predictable temperatures, abundant food. Within hours, every assumption broke. Herds fragmented. Migration routes became meaningless when everywhere was equally devastated. Predators stopped hunting because prey was either dead or impossible to find in the darkness. The entire behavioural ecology of the Cretaceous simply stopped functioning. Birds and pterosaurs faced unique challenges. Flying requires enormous energy expenditure. Both groups needed to feed frequently to maintain their metabolisms. But flying in complete darkness was nearly impossible. Birds with good night vision might manage short flights, but sustained migration was out of the question. Pterosaurs, some with wingspans exceeding 30 feet, needed thermal currents for efficient flight. Those thermals depended on solar heating. Without sun, pterosaurs were grounded, and a grounded Quetzalcoatlus was just a very large, very vulnerable target for any predator desperate enough to attack it. Mammals, nocturnal and small, had some advantages. They were already adapted to darkness. Their whiskers, acute hearing and sensitive noses let them navigate without light. Their small size meant they needed less food, and crucially, their fur provided insulation against temperature drops. While dinosaurs shivered in the darkness, mammals maintained body temperature through metabolic heat. This wasn't a fair fight. It was an accident of evolutionary history that gave mammals advantages they hadn't earned through competition. The darkness lasted months. Geological evidence suggests that significant light reduction persisted for at least a year, possibly longer. This extended blackout was longer than any organism could survive without eating. The starvation that began in the first days would claim the vast majority of land animals before sunlight returned. While darkness spread across the sky, fire spread across the land. The initial firestorms ignited by radiant heat and falling ejecta were just the beginning. Within 12 hours of impact, fires covered an estimated 70% of the planet's forested areas. These weren't normal wildfires that burned hot and moved on. They were sustained conflagrations that continued for weeks, consuming everything combustible and converting forests that had stood for millions of years into charcoal and ash. The evidence for these fires is written in stone. The geological boundary layer between the Cretaceous and Paleogene, known as the K-PG boundary, contains massive concentrations of soot. Chemical analysis shows this soot came from burning vegetation, not volcanic activity or impact vaporization. The quantities are staggering, enough soot to represent the combustion of most terrestrial plant biomass on Earth. Some estimates suggest that 80% of global forests burned within the first month after impact. The fires were driven by multiple factors. First, the radiant heat from re-entering ejecta ignited vegetation across vast areas simultaneously. Second, the impact occurred during what was likely a dry season in many regions, leaving forests primed to burn. Third, Cretaceous atmospheric oxygen levels were higher than today, around 25 to 30% compared to our current 21%. This oxygen-rich air made combustion more efficient. Fires that might smoulder today would have raged in the Cretaceous atmosphere. And fourth, once fires started, they created their own weather systems, generating winds that spread flames faster than any animal could flee. Dinosaurs caught in these firestorms had no escape. Large theropods like Tyrannosaurus might outrun the initial flames, but sustained fires covering thousands of square miles left nowhere to go. Herds of ceratopsians and hadrosaurs, which might normally scatter when threatened, found themselves surrounded by walls of fire advancing from multiple directions. Their size, usually an advantage, became a liability. They couldn't hide in burrows, couldn't climb to escape, couldn't fly away. They could only run until the fires caught them or until exhaustion made running impossible. Smaller dinosaurs fared little better. Theropods the size of chickens might find temporary shelter in rock crevices or stream beds, but the fires burned for weeks. Even areas initially spared would eventually be reached by advancing flames or by new ignitions from falling embers. The only real safety was underground, but dinosaurs hadn't evolved burrowing behaviors. That ecological niche was occupied by mammals, and that accident of evolutionary history saved them. The smoke from these fires added another layer to the atmospheric blackout. Fresh soot particles, still hot from combustion, rose into the stratosphere where they joined the impact ejecta. This combination created the darkest conditions Earth had experienced in hundreds of millions of years. The smoke also carried toxic compounds, carbon monoxide, nitrogen oxides, and complex hydrocarbons from burning plants. Animals that survived the flames often succumbed to smoke inhalation. Marine environments weren't spared from the fire's effects. Ash and soot washed into rivers and oceans, clogging gills of fish, coating seafloors, and altering water chemistry. The combustion of so much organic material released enormous quantities of carbon dioxide, which dissolved into oceans and made them more acidic. This ocean acidification was particularly deadly for organisms with calcium carbonate shells, ammonites, many mollusks, and planktonic foraminifera. Their shells began dissolving even as they tried to grow them. The fires also released stored carbon from millions of years of plant growth. This created a complicated climate scenario. In the short term, the ash and soot blocked sunlight, causing rapid cooling. But in the long term, years to decades after the impact, the carbon dioxide from burned vegetation would warm the planet. Survivors would have to endure not just cold and darkness, but eventually a sudden swing back to extreme greenhouse conditions. The climate whiplash would prove nearly as deadly as the initial impact. Paleobotanical evidence shows the severity of plant die-off. Fossil pollen profiles from sites like Hell Creek show a sudden disappearance of diverse Cretaceous flora immediately after the KPG boundary, replaced by massive spikes in fern spores. This fern spike indicates that forests were completely destroyed, and that ferns, fast-growing colonizers of disturbed ground, were the first plants to return. But that recovery took years. In the immediate aftermath, the landscape was ash, charcoal, and bare ground. For herbivorous dinosaurs, this was a death sentence. Even if they survived the impact, the tsunamis, the darkness, and the fires, they faced a world without food. An adult Edmontosaurus weighed several tons and needed to eat constantly. Without plants, starvation was inevitable. Smaller herbivores might survive slightly longer on stored body fat, but not long enough for forests to regrow. The herbivore die-off was complete within weeks to months. Carnivores initially benefited from abundant carrion. Dead dinosaurs littered the landscape, providing easy meals. But this resource was finite. Once the carrion was consumed, predators faced the same starvation as their prey. A Tyrannosaurus required massive amounts of meat. Estimates suggest 100 to 300 pounds per week. When living prey disappeared, even the apex predators began dying. Theropods adapted for hunting fast prey couldn't switch to scavenging exclusively. Their specialized bodies, honed by millions of years of predation, couldn't adapt to a world without prey in the span of weeks. The fires burned themselves out eventually. Rain, generated by the moisture released from burning vegetation, fell in torrents, creating flash floods that washed ash into rivers and oceans. But the damage was done. The Cretaceous forests were gone, the food webs they supported were shattered, and the darkness overhead showed no signs of lifting. The asteroid didn't just vaporize rock, it vaporized the wrong kind of rock. The Yucatan Peninsula's carbonate platform contained vast deposits of gypsum, a mineral rich in sulfur. When the impact vaporized these deposits, it released somewhere between 100 and 500 billion tons of sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere. This gas combined with atmospheric moisture to form sulfuric acid, creating acid rain of an intensity never witnessed in human history. The acid rain began within hours of impact. As the ejecta plume cooled, water vapor condensed around sulfuric acid aerosols, forming droplets with pH levels between 0 and 1, comparable to battery acid. This wasn't the weak acid rain caused by modern industrial pollution. This was concentrated acid capable of chemically burning any organic tissue it contacted. The rain fell globally, carried by atmospheric circulation patterns, drenching every continent with corrosive precipitation. Plants died first. Leaves, already stressed by darkness and fire, were chemically burned by the acidic rain. Cuticles designed to protect against water loss provided no defense against acid. Chlorophyll broke down. Cell walls ruptured. Within days of exposure, plants that had survived the fires succumbed to chemical damage. Forests that might have recovered from fire were killed permanently by acid deposition. Freshwater ecosystems collapsed rapidly. Rivers, lakes, and streams, already contaminated with ash from fires, became acidified to lethal levels. Fish died en masse. Amphibians, with their permeable skin, died even faster. Freshwater crocodilians and Champsosaurs, having survived 200 million years of evolutionary challenges, suffocated as acidified water damaged their respiratory systems. Aquatic plants dissolved. The entire freshwater food web, from microscopic algae to top predators, crashed within weeks. Marine environments experienced similar devastation, but with a delayed onset. The ocean's natural buffering capacity, their ability to neutralize acids, initially protected them. But the sheer volume of sulfuric acid overwhelmed this buffer in surface waters. Ocean pH dropped by several tenths of a point, enough to dissolve the shells of ammonites, planktonic foraminifera, and many mollusks. These groups had survived multiple mass extinctions, but the rapid acidification gave them no time to adapt. Within months, most shelled marine invertebrates were extinct. The acid rain also poisoned the soil. Nutrients were leached away. Heavy metals normally bound in sediments were mobilized by the low pH, creating toxic conditions for any surviving plants trying to germinate. Seeds that had survived in the soil found themselves in a hostile chemical environment when they tried to sprout. The few plants that managed to grow were stunted, sickly, and provided minimal nutrition. Dinosaurs drinking from acidified water sources suffered internal chemical burns. Their digestive systems, evolved to process plant matter or meat, couldn't handle water with battery acid pH levels. Dehydration became a major killer, even in the midst of torrential rains. The water falling from the sky was too acidic to drink safely. Animals desperate with thirst drank anyway, suffering agonizing deaths from internal bleeding and organ failure. The sulfuric acid aerosols in the stratosphere had another effect. They reflected sunlight extremely efficiently. While soot and dust blocked light by absorbing it, sulfate aerosols blocked light by reflecting it back into space. This compounded the cooling effect, dropping global temperatures even further. Models suggest that the sulfur contribution to cooling was actually larger than the dust contribution, and lasted longer because fine aerosols stayed airborne for years. The chemical warfare extended beyond acid rain. The impact also released massive quantities of nitrogen oxides from the superheated atmosphere near ground zero. These compounds react with atmospheric moisture to form nitric acid, adding another corrosive element to the rain. Additionally, the combustion of forests released other toxins, carbon monoxide, complex hydrocarbons, and volatilized heavy metals from burning vegetation. The combination of chemical stresses created conditions incompatible with complex life. Organisms might survive darkness alone, or cold alone, or acid rain alone, but all three together was insurmountable. The multi-front assault left no refugia, no safe havens where ecosystems could persist unchanged. Every environment on Earth was transformed from habitable to hostile within days. For dinosaurs already weakened by darkness, starvation, and temperature fluctuations, the acid rain delivered a final blow. Hatchlings with soft skin were particularly vulnerable. Eggs that hadn't hatched before the impact were exposed to acidic runoff. Nesting sites carefully chosen for their protective qualities became death traps as corrosive rain pooled in depressions. The next generation of dinosaurs, the one that might have rebuilt populations, was wiped out before it could emerge from its shells. The acid rain gradually weakened as the atmosphere cleansed itself, but this process took years. Meanwhile, every precipitation event in those years was a chemical assault. Plants that attempted to recolonize were burned back. Soils that might have recovered were repeatedly leached. The planet was locked in a cycle of chemical warfare against life itself, and the weapons were being continuously resupplied by the slow mixing and fallout of stratospheric sulfur compounds. The long winter, months of darkness. By the end of the first 24 hours, survivors faced a terrifying realization. The darkness wasn't lifting. What many animals might have instinctively processed as nighttime, expecting dawn, was actually the new normal. The planet was entering an impact winter that would last months, possibly years. This wasn't a temporary eclipse or a storm system passing through. This was a fundamental alteration of Earth's energy balance. The term impact winter understates the severity. Models based on the quantity of ejecta and soot in the geological record suggest that global average temperatures dropped by 15 to 25 degrees Celsius within weeks and stayed depressed for months. In tropical regions that had never experienced cold, temperatures plummeted from 30 degrees Celsius to near or below freezing. In polar regions already experiencing months of darkness each year, the additional cooling created conditions similar to modern Antarctica. Dinosaurs had no evolutionary framework for understanding or surviving this cold. Unlike mammals, which evolved in cooler climates and developed fur and metabolic adaptations, dinosaurs were products of the Mesozoic greenhouse. Even small theropods with possible feathering weren't adapted for sustained sub-zero conditions. Their respiratory systems, skeletal structure, and metabolic strategies all assumed a warm world with predictable resources. That world no longer existed. The cold killed different organisms in different ways. Large dinosaurs, with their low surface area to volume ratios, retained heat better than small ones, but needed more food to maintain metabolic function. Small dinosaurs lost heat rapidly, but needed less food, though food of any kind was unavailable. The medium-sized species were caught in between, facing both problems without the advantages of either extreme. Reptiles and amphibians, being ectothermic, simply stopped functioning. Without external heat sources, their metabolic rates dropped to near zero. Some species might enter a state similar to hibernation, but hibernation is an evolved strategy requiring specific physiological adaptations. Most Cretaceous reptiles lacked these adaptations. They froze, their bodies crystallizing from the inside as cellular water turned to ice. Even those that avoided freezing shut down metabolically, unable to move, feed, or reproduce. Marine environments offered some protection from temperature extremes. Water has high thermal inertia. It changes temperature slowly. The oceans didn't freeze except at polar latitudes, and deep waters remained relatively stable. But surface waters, where most marine productivity occurred, cooled significantly. The marine organisms that survived did so by retreating to deeper waters or to tropical latitudes where conditions remained marginally habitable. The darkness had indirect effects beyond cold. Without photosynthesis, atmospheric oxygen levels began dropping. This decline was gradual, years to decades. But the trend was clear. Dead organic matter decomposes, consuming oxygen. No new oxygen was being produced. Wildfires continued to burn remaining dead wood, consuming more oxygen. Animals that survived the initial catastrophe faced slowly suffocating conditions as the air itself became less breathable. Scavenging became the only viable feeding strategy for surviving carnivores, but even this was limited. In cold conditions, carrion doesn't decompose quickly. It freezes, becoming difficult to consume. Animals with powerful jaws like Tyrannosaurus could potentially break through frozen tissue, but smaller predators couldn't. Meanwhile, the carrion wouldn't last indefinitely. Once the initial die-off was scavenged, no new food would appear until plants returned and herbivores could rebuild populations, a process that would take years minimum. The psychological and behavioural breakdown of dinosaur societies became complete in the long winter. Herding species scattered or gathered in confused masses. Migration patterns, usually triggered by seasonal cues, broke down when seasons stopped making sense. Territorial displays and mating behaviours ceased when survival became the only priority. The complex social structures that had evolved over millions of years, pair bonding, hierarchical herds, cooperative hunting, all dissolved in the face of conditions evolution hadn't prepared them for. Eggs and juveniles faced extinction regardless of adult survival. Most dinosaurs laid eggs that required specific temperature ranges for proper development. Too cold, and the embryos died. Even if adults survived the first months, no successful reproduction occurred. This meant that even if some adults persisted through the worst of the impact winter, they couldn't rebuild populations. The next generation was never born, making extinction inevitable even for populations that temporarily survived. Small mammals, burrowed underground, survived the cold through a combination of luck and adaptation. Their fur provided insulation. Their high metabolic rates generated body heat. Their small size meant they needed less food. And crucially, their burrows provided stable thermal environments. Underground, temperature fluctuations were muted. Even if surface temperatures dropped below freezing, burrows remained above zero. This gave mammals a thermal refuge dinosaurs couldn't access. Birds faced a mixed fate. Many species died, particularly larger ones and those dependent on specific food sources. But small-bodied birds with good insulation and flexible diets had a chance. Those that could survive on seeds, insects, or carrion made it through. Those dependent on fruit, nectar, or specific prey items went extinct. The avian survivors were generalists, not specialists, a pattern that would repeat throughout the extinction event. The long winter finally began breaking after several months, as the densest particulates settled out of the atmosphere. But breaking meant only partial sunlight penetration, enough for twilight conditions, but not for robust photosynthesis. Plant recovery began slowly, with hardy ferns and mosses appearing first. Full forest regrowth would take decades. By then, almost every large land animal would be dead. Starvation cascades. The food chain collapses. The collapse of global food webs proceeded with mathematical certainty. Each trophic level depended on the one below it, and when the foundation, primary producers, stopped producing, the entire structure toppled. Within the first month after impact, herbivorous dinosaurs began dying en masse, not from direct impact effects, but from starvation. Within 3 months, most carnivores followed. The few surviving animals were those that could subsist on detritus, seeds, or the corpses of their former world. Herbivore die-off began immediately, but accelerated after the first week. Large ceratopsians like Triceratops needed to eat 100 to 200 pounds of vegetation daily. An adult hadrosaur needed similar quantities. Within days of the darkness descending, fresh vegetation stopped growing. Standing crops of plants were quickly consumed, burned in fires, or poisoned by acid rain. Within 2 weeks, no edible vegetation remained in most ecosystems. Herbivores began starving. The physiology of starvation is brutal. Large animals have substantial energy reserves, fat deposits accumulated during better times. But these reserves are finite. A multi-ton dinosaur in starvation mode will metabolize muscle tissue, weaken dramatically, and eventually enter metabolic collapse. This process takes weeks for large animals, days for smaller ones. Paleontological evidence from the boundary layer shows mass death assemblages, large numbers of animals dying in the same location, suggesting catastrophic population crashes. As herbivores died, their bodies provided temporary resources for carnivores and scavengers. Tyrannosaurs that normally hunted living prey switched to scavenging. Smaller theropods congregated around carcasses. Opportunistic crocodilians and early mammals joined the feast. For a brief period, perhaps weeks, carrion was abundant. But this abundance was an illusion, a one-time dividend from the collapse of herbivore populations. Once consumed, it would never be replenished. Carnivore starvation followed herbivore starvation with a time lag. Small theropods with high metabolic rates began dying within weeks of the carrion running out. Larger predators lasted longer on their fat reserves. Tyrannosaurus, with its massive body, might survive for months without food. But survival without reproduction is merely delayed extinction. The fossil record shows juvenile tyrannosaurs are absent from post-impact deposits, suggesting that breeding ceased and no new generation emerged. Aquatic food webs collapsed from the bottom up. When phytoplankton died, zooplankton starved within days. Small fish died within weeks. Large predatory fish and marine reptiles died within months. The collapse was so complete that marine productivity didn't recover to pre-impact levels for millions of years. Ammonites, having survived for 350 million years through multiple mass extinctions, finally met conditions they couldn't survive. Their extinction was total. Every species, every lineage, gone. The few surviving animals were those with flexible diets and low energy requirements. Small mammals could survive on seeds, which remained viable in the soil even through months of darkness. Insects, particularly those with dormant life stages like beetles, could wait out the worst conditions. Some birds survived on insect larvae and seeds. Freshwater turtles capable of shutting down their metabolism for extended periods outlasted more active organisms. Scavengers theoretically had an advantage, but even this niche became untenable. In cold conditions, carrion froze solid. Organisms without powerful jaws or specialized tools couldn't access the meat inside frozen carcasses. Meanwhile, in areas where temperatures remained above freezing, bacteria and fungi competed for the same resource. The race to consume available carrion was won by organisms with short generation times. Microbes, not dinosaurs. One often overlooked aspect of the extinction is the loss of ecosystem services. Dinosaurs weren't just animals, they were ecosystem engineers. Sauropods knocked down trees, creating clearings for other species. Hadrosaurs spread seeds through their dung across vast distances. Theropods controlled herbivore populations, preventing overgrazing. When these animals died, they took their ecological functions with them. The Cretaceous ecosystems weren't just depopulated, they stopped functioning entirely. The timeline of starvation varied by location and species, but the outcome was universal. In Hell Creek, fossil sites show a sudden absence of dinosaur fossils above the boundary layer. In the Nemegt Formation of Mongolia, the same pattern appears. Globally, every site studied shows the same sharp cutoff: abundant dinosaur fossils below the KPG boundary, virtually none above it. This synchronous extinction across all continents is the signature of a global catastrophe, not local events. Some scientists have proposed that small populations of non-avian dinosaurs might have survived months or even years after the impact, eking out existence in isolated refugia. While possible, no fossil evidence supports this. The absence of even a single confirmed post-impact non-avian dinosaur fossil suggests that if survivors existed, they were too rare and short-lived to leave traces. Their lineages ended without descendants. The starvation cascade was complete, efficient, and irreversible. The Mesozoic food webs, constructed over 180 million years, were dismantled in months. The survivors inherited not a functioning ecosystem, but a graveyard, a planet covered in ash, bones, and silence. Survivors in the shadows who made it through. Not every animal died. In scattered pockets across the devastated planet, certain organisms found ways to survive conditions that killed the dominant life forms of the Cretaceous. These survivors shared certain traits: small body size, flexible diets, ability to enter dormancy, and often, critically, the ability to shelter underground or underwater. They didn't survive because they were superior competitors to dinosaurs. They survived because they happened to possess traits that matched the random requirements of impact survival. Mammals were the most obvious beneficiaries of the extinction. Nearly every mammal lineage present in the late Cretaceous survived into the Paleogene. These were small animals, most weighing less than a kilogram. They lived in burrows, were nocturnal, had fur for insulation, and could subsist on seeds, insects, or carrion. When the world went dark and cold, mammals already knew how to live in darkness and cold. Their burrows protected them from temperature extremes and falling ejecta. Their varied diets meant they could eat whatever was available: dead insects, seeds, fungi, roots. The fossil record shows a remarkable pattern. Mammal diversity actually increased immediately after the KPG boundary. With dinosaurs gone, mammals began exploring ecological niches that had been closed to them. Within a million years, geological instance, mammals radiated into dozens of new body forms. Some became specialized herbivores, others became aquatic. Some grew to sizes previously impossible when dinosaurs dominated. The age of mammals didn't begin because mammals competed successfully with dinosaurs. It began because an asteroid removed the competition. Birds survived, but selectively. Large ground birds went extinct. Specialized feeders dependent on specific plants or prey died out. What survived were small-bodied, generalist birds capable of eating seeds and insects. The fossil record shows a severe bottleneck. Many Cretaceous bird lineages disappeared, but a few survived and rapidly diversified. Modern bird diversity, over 10,000 species, all descends from the handful of lineages that made it through the impact winter. Interestingly, all surviving birds were capable of flight. Flightless birds, some of which existed in the Cretaceous, didn't make it through. Flight provided mobility to escape local disasters and search for resources across large areas. It also required maintaining a high-performance physiology incompatible with dormancy, meaning flying birds had to actively find food even during the worst conditions. Those that succeeded were tough, adaptable, and lucky. Crocodilians survived almost entirely intact. This is remarkable given their close relationship to dinosaurs. The key to their survival was their amphibious lifestyle and remarkable ability to shut down metabolically for extended periods. Crocodilians can survive months without food by drastically reducing their heart rate and metabolic activity. When the impact of winter hit, they simply waited it out at the bottoms of rivers and swamps. Their aquatic environment also buffered against temperature extremes. While surface conditions became lethal, underwater temperatures remained stable. Turtles and tortoises survived for similar reasons. Their shells provided physical protection. Many species could hibernate or estivate for extended periods. Aquatic turtles had the additional advantage of stable water temperatures. Tortoises that burrowed underground could escape temperature extremes. Both groups could survive on minimal food for long periods. These unglamorous traits, patience, metabolic flexibility, protective armor, proved more valuable than size, strength, or specialization. Lizards and snakes showed mixed survival. Many groups went extinct, particularly large species and those dependent on specific prey. But small-bodied squamates survived well, Their low metabolic requirements meant they could subsist on minimal food. Many species could enter torpor during unfavourable conditions. Those that burrowed or lived in rock crevices had shelter from temperature extremes. The survivors were generalists that could eat whatever crawled by. Amphibians faced severe losses. Their permeable skin made them vulnerable to acid rain. Their dependence on aquatic breeding meant they needed functioning freshwater ecosystems. Many groups went extinct, particularly large-bodied salamanders and tropical frogs. The survivors were hardy, small species capable of breeding in temporary pools and surviving in marginal habitats. Their populations were decimated, but enough individuals persisted in scattered locations to allow later recovery. Insects survived remarkably well thanks to their short generation times, diverse life strategies, and enormous population sizes. Many insects can enter diapause, a state of suspended development, for months or years. Eggs, pupae, and larvae buried in soil or wood waited out the impact of winter. When conditions improved, they emerged and rapidly rebuilt populations. Flying insects suffered more than ground-dwelling species, but even this group retained substantial diversity. Fish survival depended heavily on habitat. Freshwater fish in rivers and lakes faced acid rain and sedimentation, but had refugia in deeper waters or spring-fed systems with buffering chemistry. Marine fish in deep waters survived better than surface species. The survivors were those tolerant of low light, capable of eating detritus, and physiologically flexible. Sharks survived almost entirely. Their cartilaginous skeletons, varied diets, and ability to inhabit multiple depth zones gave them resilience. Plants survived primarily as seeds and spores. The standing vegetation was destroyed, but genetic diversity persisted in seed banks buried in soil. Ferns, with their rapid growth and wind-dispersed spores, were the first to return, creating the famous fern spike, visible in the fossil record. Angiosperms, flowering plants, had recently evolved tough, resistant seeds that could remain dormant for years. These seeds waited until conditions improved, then germinated explosively. Conifers, with slower growth rates, recovered more slowly but eventually returned. The pattern is clear. Survival correlated with specific traits, not with dominance or evolutionary sophistication. Small size, generalist diet, ability to enter dormancy, and access to shelter were survival tickets. Large size, specialization, high metabolic demands, and dependence on stable resources were death sentences. Dinosaurs, despite their 165 million years of success, happened to lack the right traits for surviving the specific conditions of impact winter. It wasn't their fault. Evolution couldn't prepare them for asteroids. The anatomy of extinction. Why dinosaurs failed. The extinction of non-avian dinosaurs was not inevitable based on their biology alone. They weren't dying out gradually before the impact. They weren't evolutionarily obsolete or outcompeted by mammals. The fossil record shows thriving, diverse populations right up until the boundary layer. Their extinction was contingent, dependent on the specific nature of the catastrophe that struck them. Understanding why they died requires examining both the impact's effects and dinosaur physiology. Size was a major factor. Most dinosaur species were large by modern standards. Even small dinosaurs were chicken-sized or larger. Large body size has advantages: protection from predators, access to high vegetation, to travel long distances. But it also has costs. Large animals need more food. They can't hide easily. They can't fit in protective burrows. When food disappeared and shelter became necessary, size became a fatal disadvantage. Metabolic rate played a crucial role. Current research suggests many dinosaurs were mesothermic, intermediate between modern reptiles and mammals. They maintained higher body temperatures than reptiles, but not through pure metabolic heat like mammals. This strategy worked perfectly in the warm Cretaceous, but failed during impact winter. They couldn't shut down like reptiles, but they couldn't maintain body temperature like mammals. They were caught in a metabolic middle ground that required resources they couldn't access. Reproductive strategy also mattered. Dinosaurs laid eggs that required specific temperature ranges for development. When temperatures dropped and remained unstable, successful egg incubation became impossible. Even if some adults survived months of cold, they couldn't reproduce. Extinction was therefore inevitable, even for surviving populations. Without successful reproduction, populations shrink to zero, regardless of how long individuals live. Dietary specialization contributed to vulnerability. The most specialized dinosaurs, those eating specific plants or hunting specific prey, died first when their resources vanished. Generalists survived longer, but still faced insurmountable challenges. Even the most flexible dinosaur diet couldn't include seeds in sufficient quantities or corpses frozen solid. Mammals, with their differentiated teeth, could gnaw through various foods. Dinosaurs with more uniform dentition couldn't adapt as easily. Lack of insulation was critical. Mammals had fur. Birds had feathers. Many dinosaurs had scales or, in some theropods, primitive feathering. But most species lacked sufficient insulation for sustained cold. A Triceratops standing in sub-zero temperatures was simply radiating heat away, with no way to retain it. Unlike mammals that curl up to reduce surface area and fluff fur for insulation, dinosaurs had limited behavioral options for heat conservation. The inability to hibernate or enter torpor was perhaps the biggest factor. Survival through extended resource scarcity requires physiological mechanisms to reduce metabolic rate dramatically. Mammals can enter hibernation. Reptiles can brumate. Dinosaurs apparently couldn't do either. They needed to remain active, which meant they needed to eat, which was impossible. This single physiological limitation might have sealed their fate even if other factors had been favourable. Geographic distribution didn't provide safety. Dinosaurs were globally distributed, so there were no distant refugia untouched by the catastrophe. The impact's effects, darkness, cold, acid rain, were global. A Tyrannosaurus in North America faced the same conditions as an Abelisaurus in South America. There was nowhere to flee, no isolated island ecosystems where conditions remain favourable. Extinction selectivity provides important clues. Within dinosaurs, smaller species survived slightly longer than larger ones. Omnivorous species outlasted strict herbivores or carnivores. But even with these gradations, no non-avian dinosaur lineage made it through. The only dinosaurs that survived were birds, small, flying, feathered, and already partially adapted for the conditions that killed their relatives. The extinction wasn't instant. The asteroid struck on day zero, but dinosaurs continued dying for months afterward. Some individuals probably survived 6 months or more after impact, but survival without population viability is meaningless. If too few individuals persist to maintain genetic diversity and successful reproduction, extinction is still the outcome. The last non-avian dinosaur probably died alone, one of a scattered handful of survivors too few and too isolated to rebuild. What kills a species isn't always what kills an individual. Starvation killed individual dinosaurs, but it was the collapse of ecosystems that killed the species. Even if scattered individuals survived on stockpiled body fat for months, they faced a world where reproduction was impossible, food would never return in time, and every day was colder than their physiology could handle. They were evolutionarily dead even while biologically alive. The comparison with birds is instructive. Birds are dinosaurs. Specifically, they're theropod dinosaurs that evolved flight, but the birds that survived were small, had excellent insulation, could fly to find scattered resources, and could eat seeds. These traits weren't evolved for surviving impact winters. they were accidental pre-adaptations. Natural selection can only work with existing variation. It can't prepare organisms for unprecedented catastrophes. Birds survived because they happened to have the right traits. Their non-flying relatives, despite being otherwise similar, lacked these traits and died. The avian exception: how birds survived. Birds are dinosaurs. This is not a metaphor, but a phylogenetic fact. They evolved from small theropod dinosaurs in the Jurassic, diversified throughout the Cretaceous, and by the end of that period included dozens of lineages with varied body sizes and ecological roles. Yet when the asteroid struck, most bird lineages went extinct along with their non-avian relatives. The few that survived became the ancestors of all 10,000 plus modern bird species. Understanding what separated surviving birds from extinct ones reveals the razor-thin margins of extinction events. Size was crucial. Large Cretaceous birds, some reaching sizes of modern turkeys or larger, didn't survive. The survivors were small, most weighing less than a kilogram. Small body size conferred multiple advantages: lower food requirements, ability to shelter in small spaces, and faster reproductive cycles allowing quicker population recovery. When food became scarce, a sparrow-sized bird could survive on resources insufficient for a turkey-sized bird. Flight capability was apparently essential. All surviving bird lineages could fly. Several groups of flightless birds existed in the late Cretaceous, including some relatively large species. None survived. Flight provided mobility to search for scattered food resources across large areas. When local conditions became intolerable, flying birds could travel to more favorable locations. Flightless birds, trapped in deteriorating local environments, had no escape. Diet flexibility determined survival within flying small-bodied species. Birds dependent on specific foods. Fruit specialists, nectar feeders, specialized insectivores died out when their food sources vanished. The survivors were omnivores and granivores, birds capable of eating seeds, various insects, small vertebrates, and carrion. Seeds were crucial. Many plants had evolved seeds capable of remaining dormant for extended periods. These seeds persisted in the soil through the impact of winter, providing food when almost nothing else did. Feather insulation gave birds a thermal advantage. Unlike scaled reptiles or even partially feathered non-avian theropods, modern-type birds had complete feather coverage with specialized down feathers for insulation. This allowed them to maintain body temperature in cold conditions. While they still needed to eat to fuel their metabolism, they lost heat more slowly than less insulated animals, reducing their energy requirements during the cold, impacted winter. Nesting behavior may have played a role. Birds that could nest in protected locations, tree cavities, rock crevices, underground burrows, gave their eggs and chicks better survival chances than ground nesting species. The fossil record is insufficient to determine nesting behaviors for all Cretaceous birds. But modern birds with flexible nesting strategies descend from impact survivors, suggesting this flexibility was present and valuable. The geographic distribution of survivors is telling. Most surviving lineages appear to have been in the southern hemisphere, particularly in areas that are now South America, Australia, and Antarctica, which was still connected to South America then. These regions may have experienced less severe immediate effects from the impact. The asteroid struck in what is now the Gulf of Mexico, meaning northern hemisphere locations took the worst of the initial blast effects and tsunamis. Egg size relative to body size mattered. Birds lay relatively large eggs compared to most reptiles, but each clutch contains fewer eggs. This represents a different reproductive strategy. Fewer offspring with higher parental investment. During the impact winter, this strategy may have been advantageous. Birds could potentially care for smaller clutches through harsh conditions, while species producing dozens of eggs with no parental care couldn't ensure any survived. The fossil record shows that bird diversity crashed at the KPG boundary but didn't reach zero. Dozens of Cretaceous bird lineages disappeared, but a few persisted. These survivors included the ancestors of modern bird groups, paleognaths, ostriches and relatives, galloancerai, waterfowl and game birds, and neoaves, all other modern birds. Within 1 million years, these lineages began diversifying rapidly, filling ecological niches left empty by extinct birds and non-avian dinosaurs. One fascinating aspect is how close birds came to complete extinction. Genetic studies suggest that all modern birds descend from very few lineages, possibly as few as 3 to 5, that survived the impact. This bottleneck effect is visible in modern bird genomes, which show reduced genetic diversity compared to what would be expected without a near-extinction event. Birds survived, but barely. A slightly different impact scenario might have wiped them out entirely. The survivors weren't necessarily the best birds in an evolutionary sense. They were simply the ones whose traits happened to match the random requirements of surviving an asteroid impact. Before the extinction, these birds weren't dominant or particularly successful compared to others. After the extinction, they were the only birds left. Evolution doesn't reward quality. It rewards fit with current conditions. When conditions change catastrophically, previous success becomes irrelevant. Post-impact bird evolution was explosive. Within 10 million years, birds had diversified into most major modern groups. They evolved specialized forms: raptors, parrots, hummingbirds, penguins. They colonized every continent and adapted to every major habitat type. They evolved flightlessness multiple times in isolated locations where predators were absent. The modern bird diversity we see is entirely post-impact radiation from a tiny handful of survivors. While terrestrial extinctions received more attention, the marine realm suffered catastrophically. The oceans, covering 70% of Earth's surface and hosting the majority of biomass, experienced a wholesale restructuring of ecosystems. The extinction selectivity in marine environments reveals important patterns about what made organisms vulnerable or resilient to rapid environmental change. The extinction struck hardest at surface waters. Phytoplankton, microscopic photosynthetic organisms forming the base of marine food webs, died within days of darkness descending. These organisms require sunlight for photosynthesis, and when sunlight dropped to near zero, they couldn't survive. Geological evidence shows a complete collapse of marine primary productivity at the KPG boundary. With the foundation gone, the entire food web toppled. Ammonites suffered total extinction. These shelled cephalopods, relatives of modern nautilus, had survived for 350 million years through multiple mass extinctions. They occupied diverse ecological niches. Some were fast swimmers hunting prey, others were slow floaters eating plankton, and everything between. Yet every single ammonite species died. The likely cause was their reproductive strategy. They produced planktonic larvae that required sunlight-driven productivity. When the base of the food web collapsed, ammonite larvae starved, and without successful reproduction, populations crashed. Mosasaurs, the ocean's apex predators, went extinct completely. These were enormous marine lizards, some reaching 50 feet long, equipped with powerful jaws and specialized teeth for catching fish, squid, and other marine prey. They were active hunters requiring large amounts of food. When the food chain collapsed from the bottom up, apex predators starved. Their large size, high metabolic demands, and position at the top of the food chain made them vulnerable to any disruption in prey availability. Plesiosaurs suffered the same fate. These long-necked marine reptiles had been successful for nearly 140 million years. They filled different ecological roles than mosasaurs, hunting in different ways and targeting different prey. But they too were large, active predators requiring abundant food. The extinction didn't discriminate based on hunting strategy. It eliminated everything that needed large amounts of food from a functioning food web. Marine crocodiles, however, survived. Unlike mosasaurs and plesiosaurs, crocodilians could survive in brackish or fresh water, giving them access to different food sources. They could also reduce their metabolic rate dramatically and survive for months without eating. The survivors were those capable of transitioning between marine and freshwater environments, and those with physiological flexibility to endure extended starvation. Fish extinction was selective. Bony fish survived better than cartilaginous fish in many groups. Those sharks also survived well overall. Deep-sea fish survived better than surface dwellers. Generalist feeders survived better than specialists. Cold water species survived better than tropical specialists. The pattern suggests that fish dependent on stable, sunlight-driven food webs were most vulnerable, while those that could exploit alternative food sources survived. Mollusks showed interesting patterns. Clams and oysters suffered heavy extinction, particularly those living in shallow waters. But deep water species survived better. Gastropods, snails and slugs had mixed survival. Marine species suffered, but freshwater and terrestrial species did better. Cephalopods, other than ammonites, specifically octopuses, squid and nautiluses, survived, though exact timing and pathways are debated. Corals suffered near total extinction. Reef-building corals depend on symbiotic algae that photosynthesize, providing most of the coral's energy. When sunlight disappeared, the algae died, and the corals couldn't survive without them. Reefs that had taken millions of years to build were killed within months. Reef ecosystems, among the most diverse marine habitats, collapsed entirely. Recovery took millions of years, and the post-impact corals were different groups than those that built Cretaceous reefs. Echinoderms, sea urchins, starfish, sea cucumbers showed varied survival. Some groups went extinct entirely. Others survived with reduced diversity. The survivors tended to be those living in deeper waters or those capable of feeding on detritus, rather than requiring active hunting or filtering of living prey. Bottom-dwelling species that could subsist on dead organic matter falling from above had advantages over species requiring living prey. Marine plankton underwent severe extinction. Foraminifera, single-celled organisms with calcium carbonate shells, suffered catastrophic losses. About 90% of planktonic forum species went extinct. The survivors were mostly benthic bottom-dwelling species, or those with small, simple shells requiring less calcium carbonate to build. This extinction pattern reflects ocean acidification from impact-release sulfur and carbon dioxide. The recovery of marine ecosystems took millions of years. The Strangelove ocean hypothesis suggests that for hundreds of thousands of years after the impact, oceans had minimal biological productivity. They were vast, nearly sterile bodies of water with only scattered pockets of life. Fossil evidence shows dramatically reduced biodiversity and productivity in early Paleocene marine sediments. Only gradually did ecosystems rebuild, and when they did, they were fundamentally different from what existed before. One remarkable aspect is what didn't go extinct. Sharks survived almost entirely intact. Sea turtles survived, though with reduced diversity. Crocodilians, as mentioned, came through well. Certain fish lineages persisted. These survivors shared traits: ability to survive in varied conditions, flexibility in diet, capability to endure extended periods of low food availability, and in some cases, ability to move between marine and freshwater environments. The marine extinction teaches an important lesson. Even in the ocean, which covers most of the planet and has enormous thermal inertia, the impact's effects were devastating and near global. There was no true refugia, no places where conditions remained completely stable. The survivors were those with physiological resilience and ecological flexibility, not those that were previously dominant or evolutionarily superior. The selectivity of death, patterns in extinction. Mass extinctions are not random. They follow patterns revealing which traits confer survival and which guarantee death. The K-Peach extinction shows clear selectivity based on body size, diet, habitat, reproductive strategy, and geographic location. Understanding these patterns helps explain why certain lineages survived, while apparently similar ones perished. Body size shows the strongest correlation with extinction risk. Across all environments, large-bodied organisms had higher extinction rates. On land, virtually everything over 25 kilograms went extinct. In oceans, the largest marine reptiles died while smaller fish survived. The mechanism is straightforward. Large animals need more food, can't hide easily, take longer to reproduce, and have smaller population sizes. All these factors increase vulnerability to catastrophic environmental change. Diet determines survival within size classes. Herbivores dependent on fresh vegetation died when plants stopped growing. Carnivores dependent on living prey died when prey populations collapsed. Omnivores and detritivores, organisms that could eat dead matter, seeds, insects, or varied foods, had better survival rates. The most successful survivors were dietary generalists capable of exploiting whatever food sources remained available. Habitat provided differential survival chances. Freshwater organisms had higher survival rates than exclusively marine ones. Terrestrial organisms that could access aquatic habitats, like crocodilians, survived better than purely terrestrial species. Burrowing organisms survived better than surface-dwelling ones. The pattern reflects the importance of shelter from temperature extremes and access to multiple resource types. Reproductive strategy mattered significantly. Organisms producing many offspring with no parental care mostly went extinct. Those producing fewer offspring with parental investment survived better. This pattern appears across vertebrates. Birds with parental care survived, while reptiles laying many eggs that developed independently mostly died. The harsh post-impact environment favoured quality over quantity in offspring production. Geographic location influenced survival, though less than biological traits. Organisms in the southern hemisphere may have had slightly better survival chances than northern hemisphere species. The impact occurred in the northern hemisphere tropics, meaning initial effects, ejecta bombardment, tsunamis, direct blast effects, were most severe there. However, the atmospheric effects were global, so geography provided only marginal advantages. Ecological specialization was a death sentence. Specialists, organisms evolved for specific foods, habitats, or environmental conditions, died at higher rates than generalists. Flowering plants that required specific pollinators went extinct when pollinators died. Predators hunting specific prey died when that prey vanished. Specialists had invested evolutionary time in optimization for stable conditions. That optimization became fatal when conditions changed completely. Metabolic rate shows interesting patterns. High metabolism organisms like active predators died at higher rates than low metabolism ones like crocodilians. But there's a U-shaped curve. Very low metabolism organisms that couldn't move to find resources also struggled. Optimal survivors had moderate metabolisms, allowing both activity when needed and dormancy when resources disappeared. Dependency on sunlight-driven ecosystems was lethal. Photosynthetic organisms, herbivores eating them, and carnivores hunting those herbivores all suffered. But detritivores, organisms eating dead organic matter, initially benefited from enormous quantities of dead material. Fungi, bacteria, insects that ate decaying matter, and scavengers had temporary resource abundance before the dead material was consumed. Population size provided resilience. Organisms with large geographic ranges and abundant populations could lose 99% of individuals and still have enough survivors to rebuild. Species with small ranges or low population densities went extinct even if they possessed otherwise favourable traits. This explains why some seemingly well-adapted species died. They were simply too rare to weather catastrophic losses. Generation time influenced recovery potential. Organisms with rapid reproduction, insects, small mammals, many birds, could rebuild populations quickly once conditions improved. Long-lived organisms with slow reproduction, large dinosaurs, marine reptiles, couldn't recover even if some individuals survived months after impact. Population growth rate matters as much as individual survival. The selectivity reveals that extinction isn't about evolutionary quality. Many extinct organisms were highly successful, perfectly adapted to their environments, occupying important ecological roles. They died because their adaptations were specific to a world that suddenly ceased to exist. The survivors weren't better, they just happened to have traits matching the new, temporary conditions of impact winter and its aftermath. The surviving organisms faced a planet transformed beyond recognition. The first year after impact was possibly more lethal than the impact itself, as ecosystems remained collapsed and conditions stayed hostile. The darkness gradually lifted, but temperatures remained cold. Acid rain continued intermittently. Food chains stayed broken. Survivors had escaped immediate death only to face prolonged suffering in a world that couldn't yet support complex life. Plants began returning after several months, but in altered form. The famous fern spike in the fossil record shows that ferns were the first plants to recolonize devastated landscapes. Fern spores, distributed by wind and capable of lying dormant, germinated in disturbed soils. But ferns provided poor nutrition for herbivores adapted to flowering plants or conifers. The returning vegetation was alien to surviving herbivores. Temperatures remained unstable. The initial impact of winter gave way to longer-term cooling as sulfate aerosols persisted in the stratosphere for years. But eventually, the greenhouse gases released by the impact and subsequent fires began warming the planet. Survivors faced not stable conditions, but wild swings, cold years followed by hot years, with climate changing faster than organisms could adapt. Oxygen levels declined slowly but measurably. The combustion of forests and ongoing decomposition of dead organic matter consumed oxygen faster than photosynthesis could replace it. This decline wasn't immediately lethal, but added stress to already weakened organisms. Reduced oxygen meant reduced metabolic capacity, making survival and reproduction more difficult. Soil fertility collapsed. The topsoil that supported Cretaceous forests was washed away by acid rain, burned by fires or buried under ash. What remained was infertile, chemically altered, lacking the microorganisms that make soil productive. When seeds germinated, they grew slowly in poor conditions. The lush productivity of the Cretaceous didn't return. It was replaced by sparse, stunted vegetation. Disease became rampant. Weakened organisms with compromised immune systems faced infections they could normally resist. Dead bodies everywhere provided breeding grounds for bacteria. Parasites lost their preferred hosts and switched to new ones. The disrupted ecosystems lacked the normal checks and balances that controlled disease, allowing pathogens to spread unchecked through weakened populations. Mutations accumulated in surviving populations. The environmental stress, radiation from the impact, chemical mutagens in the atmosphere, UV exposure from damaged ozone layer, caused genetic damage. Most mutations were harmful, reducing fitness further. Populations already struggling to survive now produced many offspring with genetic defects that would have been eliminated by selection in stable conditions. Ecosystems that began recovering faced new challenges. Early successional species, ferns, hardy insects, small mammals, colonized disturbed areas. But these assemblages bore no resemblance to Cretaceous ecosystems. The complex interactions between plants, herbivores, predators, and decomposers that characterize the Cretaceous were gone. Simple, unstable ecosystems replaced them. Islands of survival may have existed, places where local conditions remained marginally favorable. Perhaps a valley protected from the worst winds, or a spring-fed stream that didn't acidify, or a forest edge that didn't burn completely. These refugia would host higher densities of survivors, but even these relative safe havens were stressed compared to pre-impact conditions. And as resources depleted, competition intensified. Predator-prey relationships broke down. Surviving carnivores faced disappearing prey. Herbivores faced disappearing plants. The numerical relationships that had stabilized ecosystems through predation and grazing no longer held. Some species may have gone extinct, not from starvation, but from predation pressure as desperate carnivores attacked anything they could catch. Reproduction remained difficult, even for organisms that survived personally. Producing viable offspring required resources most didn't have. Female mammals needed calories to gestate young. Birds needed protein to form eggs. Even with successful reproduction, offspring faced the same hostile world that killed most adults. Population growth was negligible or negative. The fossil record from the first million years after impact, the early Paleocene, shows dramatically reduced biodiversity. Fossil sites that contain dozens of Cretaceous species contain only a handful of Paleocene ones. The survivors were present but not thriving. They persisted in low numbers, barely maintaining populations, not expanding or diversifying significantly. Some organisms went extinct during this aftermath period rather than immediately. They survived impact effects, but couldn't survive the sustained resource scarcity and environmental instability. This drawn-out extinction appears in the fossil record as zombie taxa, organisms present immediately after the boundary, but disappearing within thousands to tens of thousands of years. The first year tested survivors as harshly as the impact day. Those that made it through possessed not just the right physical traits, but also remarkable luck. They happened to be in the right places, found the right food at the right times, avoided disease and predation, and successfully reproduced despite terrible odds. Survival wasn't a reward for quality, it was an accident of circumstance. Why it happened? The cosmic accident. The asteroid that killed the dinosaurs was a cosmic accident of staggering improbability. Its existence, trajectory, and timing were products of random chance. Understanding the chain of events that brought this mountain of rock from the asteroid belt to Earth reveals how fragile complex life is when faced with extraterrestrial threats. The asteroid probably originated in the main asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter. This region contains millions of objects ranging from grains of sand to dwarf planets. They're the leftover debris from the solar system's formation, prevented from coalescing into a planet by Jupiter's gravitational influence. These objects orbit the Sun in relatively stable paths. But relatively is key. Over millions of years, gravitational perturbations from planets can shift these orbits slightly. The Chicxulub impactor, named for the town near the crater it created, was probably about 6 miles, 10 kilometers, in diameter. It wasn't the largest asteroid in the belt, but it was catastrophically large from Earth's perspective. An object this size contains mass equivalent to trillions of tons. When moving at typical asteroid belt velocities, it carries kinetic energy beyond human comprehension. Something nudged this asteroid onto a collision course with Earth. Perhaps a collision with another asteroid altered its orbit slightly. Perhaps Jupiter's gravity tugged it during a close passage. Perhaps the Yarkovsky effect, where absorbed sunlight creates tiny thrust, pushed it over millions of years. Whatever the cause, the asteroid's orbit shifted from stable and circular to elliptical and planet-crossing. The timing was random. The asteroid could have arrived any time in Earth's 4.5 billion year history. It happened to arrive 66 million years ago. If it had arrived 10 million years earlier or later, the species that died would have been different. If it had arrived 200 million years earlier, dinosaurs might never have risen to dominance. If it had missed Earth entirely, dinosaurs might still rule today. The angle and location of impact mattered enormously. The asteroid struck at roughly 60 degrees from horizontal, steep enough for maximum energy release, but shallow enough to maximize atmospheric interaction and ejector dispersal. It struck carbonate rock rich in sulfur, releasing deadly aerosols. If it had struck granite or ocean without carbonate platform, the extinction might have been less severe. The impact speed was approximately 45,000 miles per hour, 20 kilometers per second. This is typical for asteroids crossing Earth's orbit. At this velocity, the kinetic energy of a 6-mile rock exceeds the energy from burning all fossil fuels on Earth thousands of times over. The comparison to atomic bombs understates the power. This was a geological event, not merely a large explosion. The trajectory took it past Mars without collision, a matter of timing measured in hours. It passed through the Earth-Moon system without hitting the Moon, a matter of spatial precision measured in thousands of miles. It struck Earth rather than missing entirely, a matter of orbital mechanics, where slight differences early in the trajectory mean enormous differences at journey's end. No defense was possible. Life on Earth had no way to detect, track, or deflect an incoming asteroid. Even if dinosaurs possessed intelligence and technology, the warning time would have been days to weeks at most, insufficient for planetary evacuation, even if such a thing made sense. The impact was inevitable once the trajectory was set, which likely occurred thousands or millions of years before impact. The probability of such an impact is calculable. Objects of this size strike Earth approximately once every 100 million years on average. But average means little for individual events. The next impact could be tomorrow or 200 million years from now. Earth has been struck multiple times in its history. Each impact reset evolution, eliminating dominant organisms and creating opportunities for others. Other planets show evidence of similar impacts. The Moon's surface is covered with craters. Mars shows enormous impact basins. Mercury is heavily cratered. These scars reveal that asteroid impacts aren't rare in cosmic terms. They're a normal part of planetary existence. Earth's active geology and atmosphere erase most impact evidence, but the craters exist in the geological record. The Chicxulub crater, now buried under kilometers of sediment, was identified in the 1990s through geophysical surveys. Its structure, a peak ring basin 110 miles across, records the violence of the impact. The rock inside shows shock features possible only from extreme pressure. Melted rock cools into distinctive textures. Diamonds form from carbon under instantaneous pressure. The crater is a time capsule preserving the mechanics of planetary catastrophe. The asteroid's composition remains uncertain. Chemical analysis of the boundary layer shows it contained typical asteroid metals: iridium, platinum, osmium in ratios matching certain asteroid types. It likely was a carbonaceous chondrite or similar primitive asteroid. Its exact parent body will never be known. It vaporized on impact, its atoms scattered across the planet. The cosmic accident killed the dinosaurs not through malice or purpose, but through the physics of kinetic energy transfer. A rock traveling at 45,000 miles per hour struck an occupied planet. The energy had to go somewhere, into heat, shock waves, ejector, atmospheric disruption. Life just happened to be in the way. The universe didn't care about dinosaurs, mammals, or anything else. It simply obeyed its laws, and those laws included conservation of momentum and energy. The dawn of mammals, a new world rising. The morning of the Paleocene epoch, the first day after the Cretaceous ended, dawned over a planet that was simultaneously devastated and full of potential. The dominance of dinosaurs, established 230 million years earlier and maintained through the Triassic, Jurassic and Cretaceous, was over. The survivors inherited a world emptied of its previous rulers, and among those survivors, mammals were positioned to seize an opportunity 160 million years in the making. Cretaceous mammals had been small, nocturnal, and ecologically marginalised. The largest were badger-sized. Most were mouse to rat-sized. They occupied niches dinosaurs didn't: nighttime hunting, underground living, arboreal lifestyles in the smallest branches. They were successful in their own right, having diversified into numerous lineages, but they lived in the shadows, literally and figuratively, of dinosaurian dominance. The extinction changed everything. Within the first million years of the Paleocene, mammal body sizes began increasing. Forms appeared that hadn't existed before. Some became specialized herbivores, processing the returning vegetation. Others became carnivores, hunting the abundant smaller animals. Still others became omnivores, exploiting the varied food sources of recovering ecosystems. The fossil record shows an explosion of mammal diversity unlike anything during the Mesozoic. The niches previously occupied by dinosaurs were now empty. Large herbivore niches, browsing on trees, grazing on low plants, had been dinosaur territory. Within 10 million years, mammals evolved into these roles. Early ungulates appeared, the ancestors of today's hoofed mammals. They were awkward, primitive compared to later forms, but they were filling roles that dinosaurs could no longer occupy. Carnivore niches also opened. Mesozoic mammals had been mostly insectivorous or hunted small vertebrates. With dinosaurs gone, larger prey became available and no large terrestrial predators existed to compete. Early carnivorous mammals evolved, experimenting with new hunting strategies. These weren't yet the cats, dogs or bears we know. Those would come later, but they were the first steps toward mammalian carnivores that could take down large prey. Flight evolved independently in mammals. Bats appeared in the fossil record about 50 million years ago, relatively quickly after the extinction in geological terms. They exploited the nocturnal aerial niche, catching insects at night, much as insectivorous birds do by day. This duplication of birds' flying strategy, but in different time periods, shows how evolution fills available niches with whatever organisms are capable. Aquatic mammals evolved multiple times. Whales evolved from terrestrial ancestors around 50 million years ago, rapidly adapting to marine life. Other groups, seals, sea lions, walruses, evolved separate aquatic adaptations. The marine niches left empty by mosasaurs, plesiosaurs, and other Mesozoic marine reptiles were eventually filled by mammals, though it took millions of years and produced very different body forms. Size evolution was spectacular. From mouse-sized Cretaceous ancestors, mammals evolved into the largest land animals since dinosaurs. Indoricotheres, giant hornless rhinoceros relatives, stood 18 feet tall at the shoulder 30 million years ago, rivaling smaller sauropods. This size increase demonstrates that dinosaurs hadn't occupied large herbivore niches because mammals were incapable, but because dinosaurs were already there. Once competition was removed, mammals could and did grow large. Primate evolution began in this post-impact world. The earliest primates appeared within 10 million years of the extinction. Small arboreal forms adapted for life in trees. These primitive primates were nothing like modern monkeys or apes. They more closely resembled tree shrews. But they established the lineage that would eventually lead to humans. Without the asteroid, primates might never have evolved, and humans certainly wouldn't exist. Brain size increased across many mammal lineages. Compared to similar-sized reptiles, mammals have much larger brains relative to body size. This trend accelerated in the Paleocene and Eocene as mammals diversified. The cognitive advantages of larger brains, better problem solving, more flexible behaviour, enhanced memory, became more valuable in complex changing ecosystems. The selection pressure for intelligence increased as niches became more competitive. Social complexity evolved in multiple mammal groups. Herding in ungulates, pack hunting in carnivores, social groups in primates, all appeared in the Cenozoic era that followed the extinction. Dinosaurs had shown some social behaviours, but mammals took sociality to new levels. The development of extended parental care, social learning and cooperative behaviours gave mammals advantages in adapting to changing environments. Diversity exploded. Today's 5,000 plus mammal species all descend from the handful of lineages that survived the KPG extinction. Within 10 million years of the impact, mammals had diversified into most major groups we recognise today. Within 50 million years, they occupied virtually every terrestrial niche and many aquatic ones. The age of dinosaurs had ended. The age of mammals had begun. The irony is profound. Mammals didn't win through superiority. They didn't outcompete dinosaurs. They survived an asteroid impact through luck and traits accidentally suited to impact winter. Then, in the aftermath, they inherited an empty world and filled it with incredible diversity. Evolution doesn't have foresight. It only responds to current conditions. The mammals that evolved in dinosaurs' shadows became dominant not through long-term planning, but through surviving when dinosaurs couldn't. The lesson is humbling. Humans exist because an asteroid struck Earth 66 million years ago. Our entire evolutionary lineage, primates, mammals, even the synapsids that gave rise to mammals, might have remained marginal forever if dinosaurs had continued ruling. We owe our existence not to our ancestors' superiority, but to cosmic bad luck that befell the previous rulers of Earth.